My name is Elena Morrison. I'm 38 years old and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. A woman from church hugged me in the grocery store between the oranges and the bottled juices and whispered in my ear, "You'll get through this, sweetheart. We're all praying for you." I froze. Actually froze, because as far as I knew, nobody was supposed to know anything. Not yet. Not about what had happened the night before. Not about the conversation that changed everything. Not about the thing I still hadn't even fully processed myself. I just stood there holding a carton of strawberries like my brain had stopped working. The woman smiled gently, patted my arm, and walked away, like what she said made perfect sense. But it didn't. Because this wasn't vague concern. This was sympathy. Specific sympathy. The kind people give when they already know something painful. And that wasn't even the worst part. By the time I got home, there were flowers waiting for me. Sympathy flowers. With a card that made my stomach drop. And suddenly, I had one terrifying question. Who was telling strangers about my life? And why did this feel weirdly familiar? If you've ever had someone betray your trust in the most unexpected way, subscribe right now. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let me tell you what really happened. The flowers arrived at 8:14 that morning. White lilies, pale pink roses. One of those tasteful, expensive arrangements people send when something tragic happens, but they still want to seem elegant about it. The delivery man smiled like this was normal. Asked me to sign. I looked at the card. Praying for peace during this painful transition. No name. Just that. My stomach dropped so fast I actually had to sit down. Because Daniel had left for work less than an hour earlier, and the only person I had told the night before was my mother. Margaret. I remember staring at those flowers thinking maybe this was some bizarre mistake. Wrong address, wrong Elena. But it wasn't. My name was written clearly. That's when Sophie walked in, looked at the flowers, then looked at me, and asked, "Mom? Did someone die?" The night before, my mother had sounded calm. Too calm, actually. I called her after Daniel and I had the conversation. Not a fight. No screaming. No betrayal confession. Just emotional exhaustion. The kind where two people sit at opposite ends of a couch and admit they haven't really been married for a long time. Daniel said he thought we'd become roommates who knew each other's coffee orders. And honestly, that hurt because it was true. I called my mother because mothers are supposed to be safe places. I told her quietly, asked her not to say anything yet. Specifically said, "Please don't tell anyone until Sophie knows." She made that soft, sympathetic noise mothers make. Said of course. Said she understood. Said she'd pray. Now less than 12 hours later, there were sympathy flowers in my kitchen. That afternoon, I went to the grocery store because life is rude like that. Marriage might be ending. Bills still exist. Children still need cereal. I was halfway through produce when Linda Hastings spotted me. Linda, church friend, mid-60s, always perfectly curled hair and floral perfume strong enough to enter a room before she does. She came straight toward me with this expression. Soft. Sympathetic. Performatively gentle. Before I could even say hello, she hugged me, tight, and whispered, "You're stronger than I'd be." I actually pulled back and stared at her. She patted my arm, like I was fragile, then walked away. No explanation, no clarification, just left me standing there holding avocados like my life had become public property. That's when panic started replacing confusion. Because this wasn't random anymore. Someone was talking. That evening, Sophie got quieter. Children notice emotional weather faster than adults admit. She kept watching me, watching the flowers, watching my face when my phone buzzed. At dinner, she pushed peas around her plate and finally asked, "Did I do something wrong?" That question broke me a little. Because no child asks that unless they already feel tension they can't explain. I put my fork down immediately, told her no. Absolutely not. She nodded, but didn't look convinced. Then she asked, "Why are people sending you sad flowers?" And that was the moment I realized something ugly. My daughter was becoming collateral damage, and I still didn't even know who caused it. The next morning, my neighbor Mrs. Carter caught me bringing trash cans in. She smiled in that too interested suburban way, then said, "So, will Daniel still be doing weekends?" I stopped moving. Actually just stood there. Because that question wasn't vague sympathy. That was specific. Custody specific. Meaning whoever was talking wasn't just saying, they're having trouble. They were sharing details. Or inventing them. I asked her where she heard that. She gave that fake innocent shrug people do when they absolutely know what they're doing. "Oh, I just heard things." Heard things. I went back inside shaking, because now this wasn't gossip. This was leakage, and somebody close enough to know context was the source. The obvious suspect was Daniel. Who else knew? No one. At least that's what I thought. And Daniel had been strange lately. Not cruel, not dramatic. Just distant. Quiet. Emotionally unavailable in a way that felt almost pre-decided. Like he'd mentally left months before saying it out loud. That morning, I remembered he'd been on his phone late. Screen turned away. Typing. Then quickly locking it when I came into the room. At the time, I ignored it. Now, it looked different. Maybe he told someone, a coworker, a sibling, a friend whose wife happened to know Linda. Gossip spreads weirdly fast, and suddenly Daniel moved from grieving husband to possible leak. That night, Daniel left his phone charging in the kitchen while showering, and I did something I'm not proud of. I looked. Not because I'm naturally suspicious. I'm not. I'm actually the kind of person who gives people too much trust for too long, but someone was exposing my life, and I needed answers. I checked messages, recent calls, texts, nothing. No suspicious conversations, no dramatic confessions, no, "Can you believe Elena wants a divorce?" Nothing. Then I found one draft text unsent. It simply said, "I never thought it would end like this." No recipient. No context. That somehow made it worse, because now Daniel looked sad. Not guilty. And I still had no suspect. The second bouquet arrived the next morning. Yellow roses this time, smaller, cheaper, but somehow worse. Because now this was clearly a pattern. This card had a name. "Thinking of you." Patricia. Patricia sang alto in my mother's church choir. A woman I barely knew. A woman I had not spoken to in months. I called my mother immediately, asked her directly, "Did you tell anyone?" Silence. Brief. Tiny. But I heard it. Then she said, "Well, I may have asked for prayer." That phrase, something about it made my chest tighten, because it sounded harmless, but clearly, it wasn't. And then something weird happened. A memory surfaced. Years earlier, during fertility struggles, Daniel and I had been trying for months, painfully, privately. And one Sunday, a woman from church hugged me and said, "God's timing is perfect, sweetheart." I had never told her anything. Then after my miscarriage, 3 separate women sent sympathy cards. Again, without me announcing anything. At the time, grief made everything blurry. I didn't question it. But now it looked different. This might not be the first leak. This might be a pattern. And if it was, the list of suspects just got much smaller. That night after Sophie went to bed, I sat in my kitchen staring at dead flower petals, thinking, replaying years. Private things that somehow became public. Fertility struggles, arguments, stress, things I had only told one person, my mother. Margaret always framed things beautifully, gracefully, never as gossip, always concern, always prayer, always family. But concern can become exposure real fast when consent disappears. And for the first time, I asked myself something I never wanted to ask. Not, who leaked my divorce? But, How long has my mother been telling strangers my secrets? Because the next suspect wasn't Daniel. And if I was right, this betrayal started years ago. When your private life suddenly becomes public, your mind starts with the obvious person. Daniel? Who else had been there that night? Who else knew exactly what happened? And if I'm being fair, Daniel had been acting strange for months. Not cruel, not dramatic. Just emotionally distant in a way that made you question your own instincts. The kind of distance that doesn't scream betrayal, but whispers detachment. And once suspicion enters your mind, everything looks different. The late-night phone use, the quiet sighs, the weird calm. Maybe he had told someone, a coworker, a friend, his sister. Maybe one conversation became 5. Maybe sympathy spreads faster than truth. I didn't want to believe that, but I couldn't ignore it either. That night, after Sophie went to bed, I asked him directly. No accusation, just calm, measured. I asked, "Did you tell anyone?" Daniel looked genuinely confused, then hurt. Not defensive, not angry, just tired. He sat down slowly and asked what I meant. I told him about the flowers, the grocery store, the whispers, the sympathy. And for the first time in days, I saw actual emotion in his face, not guilt. Something closer to sadness. He said, "Elena, I haven't even told my brother." That should have reassured me. Instead, it made this worse. Because if he was telling the truth, then someone else had access. That conversation shifted in a direction I didn't expect. Daniel rubbed his face and said something painfully honest, something that still sits with me. He said, "I didn't betray you, but I also stopped fighting for us a long time ago." That sentence hurt more than yelling would have, because yelling means passion, conflict means engagement. But emotional surrender? That's colder. That's final. I asked him why he stayed if he felt that way. He looked down for a long time before answering, then said, "Because leaving felt worse than staying." And honestly, that sounded terrifyingly true for both of us. But it still didn't explain the leak. I did something I'm not proud of. I checked his phone. Not because I'm naturally suspicious. I'm not. I'm the kind of woman who gives people too many chances. But this was my daughter. My privacy. My life. And someone was exposing it. So while Daniel showered, I looked. Messages, calls, email. Nothing. No suspicious texts, no emotional venting, no conversations with family, no gossip trail. Just work emails, calendar reminders, and one unsent draft that said, "I never thought we'd end up here." No recipient, no context. And somehow that made me feel worse, because it made him look human, broken, not guilty. Which meant I was back to zero. Then Nina got strange. Nina had been my best friend for 12 years, the kind of friend who knew my coffee order and my panic triggers. She texted, "Call me when you can." Normal enough, but when we talked, something felt off. Too careful, too measured. Then she said, "I can't imagine how hard last night was." I went completely still. Last night. Not recently. Not what you're going through. Specifically, last night. That timing detail mattered, because how did she know when anything happened? I asked her directly where she heard that. She hesitated. Tiny pause. But enough. And just like that, my best friend became suspect number 2. I confronted Nina harder than I intended. Asked if someone had told her. Asked if Daniel reached out. Asked if she'd heard something from mutual friends. She got offended immediately, then confused, then defensive. Which honestly made her look guiltier, until she explained. Her husband worked with someone whose wife attended my mother's church. That's how she heard. Secondhand gossip, not direct betrayal, not elegant, not malicious, just messy social leakage. I apologized. She accepted. But before hanging up, she asked one question that stayed with me. "Elena, has this kind of thing happened before?" And the scary part? I already knew the answer might be yes. 3 days later, I ran into Linda again. This time outside a coffee shop. She smiled that soft, sympathetic smile again, then said, "Transitions are hardest on children." I stared at her, because I had never mentioned Sophie. Not once, not to Linda, not publicly, no one had. At least not that I knew. So how did she know we were discussing family transition? That wording was too specific, too informed. I asked gently, "Who told you?" Linda laughed awkwardly, waved it off, said, "Oh honey, people care." That wasn't an answer. That was avoidance. And avoidance usually protects someone. Then Mrs. Carter made it worse. Again. She caught me outside while getting mail and casually asked, "Will Sophie stay in the school district?" I actually felt cold, because that meant whoever was talking wasn't sharing vague sadness. They were sharing assumptions, future planning, family details. Mrs. Carter looked embarrassed when she realized my face changed. Then she said, "I just heard you two were figuring things out." You two. Not someone, not rumor. Specific. I smiled politely, went inside, locked the door, and sat in silence. Because random gossip doesn't usually get this detailed. This felt sourced, intimate, close. That night another memory hit me. Years ago, during fertility struggles, a churchwoman had touched my arm and said, "God's timing is mysterious." I had never told her anything. Then after my miscarriage, cards arrived. Meals, sympathy. People knowing details I had never publicly shared. At the time, I thought grief blurred boundaries. Now, I wasn't so sure. This pattern suddenly looked familiar. Painfully familiar. And if this had happened before, then maybe this wasn't about my divorce at all. Maybe someone had been doing this for years. That was the real shift. The moment the mystery changed. It stopped being, "Who leaked this?" and became, "How many private moments were never actually private?" I sat in my kitchen after midnight, scrolling old memories, replaying conversations, searching emotionally, not digitally, and one person kept appearing. Again, and again, and again. Someone who always framed concern beautifully. Someone respected, trusted, elegant, polished. Someone who never looked cruel. Which somehow made this possibility even worse. Because if I was right, this betrayal didn't start with my divorce. It started years earlier. The first memory that kept replaying wasn't about my divorce. It was about infertility, years earlier. Daniel and I had been trying for almost a year. Quietly, painfully, the kind of struggle you barely admit to yourself, let alone anyone else. I remember sitting in church one Sunday pretending I was fine. Then after service, a woman I barely knew squeezed my hand and said, "God sees the women waiting." I smiled politely. But inside, I felt exposed, because I had never told her anything. At the time, I convinced myself maybe it was coincidence, generic kindness, religious language. But now it looked different. Because coincidence doesn't usually repeat itself. Patterns do. Then the miscarriage memory came back. Sharp. Clear. Uninvited. I was 10 weeks pregnant. Only a tiny circle knew. Very tiny. And when I lost the baby, sympathy cards started arriving. Meals. Flowers. Phone calls. Church women crying at me in hallways. At the time, grief made everything blurry. I didn't ask questions, didn't have energy. But now sitting in my kitchen years later, I realized something horrifying. That information had to come from somewhere, because I wasn't posting through grief. Daniel definitely wasn't making church announcements. So who told them? And why didn't I question it back then? A few nights later, Sophie said something small. Children always drop truth casually. That's what makes it devastating. She was coloring at the table and asked, "Mom, are you and Dad fighting because Grandma asked me questions?" I froze, asked what she meant. She shrugged, like it was nothing, said Grandma had asked if Daddy seemed sad lately. if Mommy cried when Sophie was asleep, if Daddy stayed downstairs sometimes. I felt physically cold, because those weren't grandmother questions. Those were information-gathering questions. And Sophie answered. Of course she did. She's 9. She trusted her grandmother. And suddenly I wondered, how much had my daughter unknowingly revealed? That night I started searching old emails. Not because I had proof, because my instincts wouldn't shut up. Archived folders, church newsletters, old prayer groups, random message chains, and buried deep, I found something. A group church email from years ago. Subject line, prayer for one of our young families. No names, but details. Specific emotional details. Marriage strain, waiting, grief. Enough to identify the situation if you knew us. No sender listed publicly. Anonymous prayer submission. I stared at that screen for a long time, because anonymous doesn't always mean unknown. Sometimes it just means protected. Then Evan called. My younger brother, 34. Charming in the exhausting way some favored sons are. The kind who lands on his feet because someone always catches him. He sounded weirdly tense, asked how I was doing, too casually, too carefully. Then slipped and said, Mom's just worried this whole thing could get messy. I went quiet immediately, because I hadn't told Evan anything. Not a word. I asked how he knew. Pause. Then he backtracked badly. Said Mom mentioned stress. Nothing specific. Sure. That conversation lasted maybe 4 minutes. But when I hung up, I knew one thing. The leak had reached family too. I called him back. Direct this time. Asked what exactly Mom said. He got irritated fast, which was telling. Then defensive. Even more telling. Finally he snapped. She was worried about Sophie, okay? There it was. Confirmation. Not full truth. But enough. I asked how much Mom shared. He refused to answer. Changed the subject. Asked if Daniel was moving out. That question made my chest tighten, because that meant discussions had gone beyond emotional sympathy. This was logistical now. Movement, living arrangements, future assumptions. And my brother, who I never told, was already operating with details. Here's the thing about Evan. My mother always protected him. Always. Late rent? Mom helped. Bad investments? Mom worried. Career instability? Mom defended. Meanwhile, I was the strong one, the capable daughter, the one who didn't need rescuing. Funny how capable children get less privacy too, less protection, more emotional exploitation disguised as admiration, because if you're strong, people assume your pain is shareable, useful, manageable. That realization hit harder than I expected. Because suddenly, this wasn't just gossip. It felt like family pattern. Old pattern. Then Daniel dropped something I wasn't expecting. Quietly. Almost reluctantly. He told me he'd been helping Evan financially. I genuinely thought I misheard. Helping how? Rent? Car repairs? Emergency transfers? A few thousand here? A few thousand there? Over time? A lot more than I expected. And my mother knew. That detail mattered. Because if our marriage collapsed publicly, those support streams might end. Family image might crack. Dependencies might get exposed. Suddenly Margaret had motive. Not proof. But motive. And motive changes everything. I sat awake that night building ugly possibilities. What if my mother leaked the divorce hoping community pressure would save the marriage? What if prayer was leverage? What if sympathy was strategy? What if public attention would shame us into reconciliation? Or worse, what if this wasn't about me at all? What if she needed Daniel stable because Evan depended on him? Needed appearances maintained, needed church optics protected, needed family looking respectable, and maybe my private pain became collateral. Again, I hated this theory, because if it was true, it meant the betrayal wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Then Sophie said something that changed everything, completely casually, while brushing her teeth. She said, Grandma said prayer ladies help fix broken families. I stopped cold. Asked when. She shrugged. Said recently. Then added, she said they were helping us. Us. That word landed like ice. Because children repeat truth without agenda. And suddenly suspicion wasn't abstract anymore. It had shape, direction, intent. But I still didn't have proof. Only fear. And fear isn't enough. At some point, suspicion becomes exhausting. You stop theorizing. You stop replaying conversations. You stop trying to decode everyone's tone. You just want proof. Real proof. Not feelings, not patterns, not painful intuition. So I made a decision. No more guessing. No more emotional detective work. If my private life had been leaked, there had to be evidence somewhere. Because gossip rarely starts in thin air. It starts with a message, a call, a forwarded conversation, something. And if this was really happening the way I feared, someone eventually would slip. They always do. 3 days later, Linda texted me. Sweet as always. Asked if I wanted coffee. Said she'd been thinking about me. Normally, I would have declined. But this time, I said yes immediately. Because Linda wasn't just church furniture. Linda was connected. Information flowed through women like Linda. Church circles have their own internet. Faster than actual internet. We met at a little cafe near Uptown. Soft jazz, tiny tables, expensive muffins nobody actually finishes. Linda hugged me again. Too warmly, too sympathetically. And I knew right then, if anyone accidentally gave me proof, it might be her. At first, nothing happened. Just normal coffee talk. Soft concern. Vague supportive phrases. The kind of language that sounds kind while saying absolutely nothing. Then Linda got up to order a refill. And left her phone face up. Buzzing. I wasn't trying to snoop. I need to be honest about that. I genuinely wasn't. But then the preview appeared. And I saw my name. My full name. My body went completely still. Because when you unexpectedly see your own name on someone else's phone, your brain reacts before morality does. And I looked. It was a forwarded message. Time-stamped. The exact same night everything happened. The wording is burned into my memory. Please keep Elena in your prayers. She and Daniel are separating. Please don't tell her I shared this. She's emotional right now. I stopped breathing. Actually stopped. Because the sender name was visible. Margaret. My mother. There it was. Not suspicion. Not theory. Proof. Clean. Direct. Calmly written. Almost elegant. Like betrayal with good manners. Linda came back smiling with coffee. And I had to act normal while my entire understanding of my family shifted under my feet. That's the part people always misunderstand. They think proof leads to immediate confrontation, shouting, tears, public scenes. It didn't. I said absolutely nothing. Sat there. Smiled when appropriate. Nodded. Sipped coffee I couldn't taste. Because shock doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks incredibly polite. I wanted to scream. Instead, I asked Linda about her granddaughter. I asked about choir. I asked normal questions while internally replaying that message again and again. Please don't tell her I shared this, meaning she knew it was wrong. That detail mattered. A lot. Driving home, something hit me harder than the divorce leak. This wasn't new behavior. Just newly visible. Suddenly childhood made sense. The weird moments. Adults knowing private things. Relatives commenting on emotions I never shared. Family friends checking in about struggles I never discussed. My mother always presented it beautifully. Concern, prayer, support, community. But stripped down? It was exposure. Information control disguised as care. And maybe she'd always done it. I just hadn't had language for it yet. That realization honestly hurt worse than the message. Because betrayal hurts differently when it's old. That night I showed Daniel the screenshot. He read it once. Then again. Then sat very quietly. After a minute he said, I always wondered how your mother knew things so fast. That sentence stunned me, because what did he mean? He told me there had been times, private conversations, arguments, emotional struggles. And somehow Margaret would call later with oddly specific concern. At the time, he assumed I told her. I assumed he told someone. Neither of us questioned it enough. That was the disturbing part. When dysfunction becomes familiar, you stop identifying it as dysfunction. The next emotional hit came from Sophie. Children don't care about adult complexity. They go straight to the wound. She asked, "Did Grandma tell the flower people?" I crouched down and asked why she thought that. She shrugged, like it was obvious. Then said, "Because Grandma tells church ladies things when people are sad. That simple. That casual. That devastating." I asked if Grandma said anything else. Sophie thought for a second, then said, "She said helpers fix families faster when everyone knows." I had to turn away for a second, because what do you even say to that? I didn't confront her immediately. No, I invited her to dinner. Calmly, politely, family dinner, neutral territory. Daniel would be there. Sophie asleep upstairs. No audience, no chaos. Just truth. She accepted easily. Sounded normal. Warm. Unbothered. Which honestly unsettled me more. Because either she believed what she did was justified, or she thought I still didn't know. Both possibilities were ugly. I spent that entire day weirdly calm, not peaceful. The kind of calm that happens when anger becomes clarity. She arrived carrying pie. Like this was a normal family dinner. Perfect coat. Perfect lipstick. Perfect polished mother energy. She kissed Sophie. Complimented the house. Asked Daniel about work. Completely ordinary. That almost made me doubt myself. Almost. Then I remembered the screenshot. The wording. The secrecy. The betrayal wrapped in religious language. After Sophie went upstairs, I sat across from my mother, folded my hands, looked directly at her, and asked one simple question. Why did strangers know about my divorce before my daughter did? And her face changed. Immediately, because her first lie came fast. Too fast. The change on my mother's face lasted maybe half a second. Then it disappeared. Replaced by confusion. Controlled confusion. The kind practice people do very well. She tilted her head and said, "What are you talking about?" Too fast. Way too fast. No pause. No genuine surprise. Just immediate defense. I reached into my folder, pulled out the screenshot, placed it between us. No dramatic movement. Just quiet. She looked down, read it, and for the first time that night, my mother stopped performing. She inhaled slowly, then said exactly what I knew she'd say. I wasn't gossiping. I was asking for prayer. That sentence, that polished sentence, probably used for years. I asked, "Without asking me?" She said, "You were emotional. Like that justified it. Like privacy becomes optional when someone else decides you're overwhelmed." I asked, "So you told strangers?" She corrected me immediately. Church family. That distinction meant everything to her, and absolutely nothing to me. Because whether strangers pray for your pain or gossip about it, they still know your pain. Without permission. Then her voice changed. Sharper. Less polished. She said, "I was trying to save your marriage." There it was. The justification. Not apology. Not accountability. Mission framing. As if betrayal becomes noble if intentions sound respectable. Daniel finally spoke. Calm. Measured. Said, "Margaret, this was private." She looked at him like he'd betrayed her too, then said, "I was helping." Helping. By exposing us. By humiliating me. By turning personal grief into community discussion. That's when I realized something. She genuinely believed she had the right. Which somehow hurt worse. Then Daniel said something I wasn't expecting. He looked at my mother and asked, "Or were you protecting Evan?" Silence. Instant. Heavy silence. My stomach dropped. Because suddenly I understood. Daniel explained, quietly. He'd been helping Evan financially for months. Rent, car payments, emergency money, thousands. Margaret knew. If Daniel and I separated publicly, those support checks would stop, and questions would start. My mother's expression told me everything before she spoke. This wasn't just prayer. This was control, damage management, image preservation, and money. Always money somewhere. She started crying, real tears, but not the kind that changed anything. She admitted it, said she panicked, said she thought church support might pressure reconciliation, said people asking questions might force us to work harder, then admitted something uglier. She worried about appearances, divorce, church gossip, family reputation, Evan's dependence, community judgment. Her exact words. I was trying to hold the family together. I looked at her and said, "By violating mine?" She cried harder. But tears are not accountability. Sometimes they're just consequences leaking out. And then the worst moment happened. Sophie came downstairs, half asleep, holding her stuffed rabbit. She looked around, saw crying, tension, silence, and asked the most brutal question in the entire story. "Grandma, if you love us, why do you tell strangers our sad things?" Nobody moved. Nobody answered. Because children destroy adult lies in one sentence. My mother covered her mouth. Daniel looked away, and I felt something in me break cleanly. Not violently, just permanently. Because once your child identifies the harm clearly, you can't keep rationalizing it. That was the moment. Not the flowers, not the screenshot, not even the confession. That question, from my daughter. I walked Sophie upstairs, tucked her in, came back down, and calmly told my mother there would be boundaries now. Real ones. No private family information shared. No prayer requests involving my life. No involving Sophie emotionally. No discussing my marriage with anyone. And distance. At least for now. She cried harder. Asked if I was punishing her. I said no. This wasn't punishment. This was protection. And honestly, I should have done it years earlier. People always want neat endings. So here's the honest one. Daniel and I didn't magically reunite, and we didn't explode either. We talked. Really talked. For the first time in years. Without outside voices. Without family interference. Without emotional performance. We admitted ugly truths. Distance. Resentment. Silence. Emotional neglect. But also something else. Respect. Enough respect to be honest. We chose counseling. Not because love guarantees survival, but because clarity deserved effort. Some marriages end from betrayal. Some die from exhaustion. Ours deserved one honest chance. The church stopped calling eventually. Flowers stopped. Casseroles stopped. Whispers stopped. Funny how fast concern disappears when information access disappears. Evan had to solve his own mess. For once. My mother hated the boundaries. Then slowly adjusted. Because boundaries feel cruel only to people who benefited from your lack of them. Sophie started sleeping better. So did I. And one afternoon she said, "Grandma asks before telling stories now." That tiny sentence meant more than any apology, because behavioral change matters more than emotional speeches. Always. I used to think betrayal had to look dramatic. Shouting, cruel words, big explosive moments. Now I know better. Sometimes betrayal arrives with sympathy flowers, soft voices, prayer language, concerned hugs, pretty handwriting on a condolence card. That's what makes it harder to recognize, and harder to heal from. My name is Elena. I'm 38. And the most painful truth I learned wasn't about my marriage. It was this. Sometimes the people who claim to protect your family are the ones quietly exposing it. If this story hit you emotionally, subscribe right now because there are more stories waiting for you. And in the comments, tell me honestly, was Margaret trying to help? Or was this betrayal from the start?